Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. We're on the module A225 Block 1, Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840. It's edited by Paul Lawrence. We're on page 318, the British Isle and the Atlantic world. This is, make sure you get a pen to highlight words that you don't know the meaning of. And also, at any point of a conversation that you can bring into an argument, make a discussion about your depiction of what the author was aiming at. Where did the author come from? Was it a primary? Was it a secondary source? There's a lot to think about, looking at the principles of things, definitions of things. Page 318. 7.3, Anti-Slavery and Abolition. During the period 1789 to 1840, the British government abolished the international slave trade, enacted various measures to ameliorate slave conditions and abolish slavery itself throughout the British Empire, with total emancipation coming in 1838 after the period of apprenticeship, discussed in section 7.4. It was brought to a premature end. These were momentous events in the history of the British Isle. Although they are very important to British social, economic, and political history, they can be understood only in the context of the role of the economic connections between the British Isle and the Atlantic world, outlined in section 7.2 above, and in the light of debates that drawn a sense of the Isle position as an Atlantic power. The idea of abolition, as you have seen in exercise 7.1, focused on Anthony Benezet. A movement in support of abolition existed in American colonies before the War of Independence. That movement, however, remained relatively limited, and in current parlance, it was more of a pressure group of lobbyists. While in the British Isle, a mass movement emerged, answer to the question of why Britain ended its involvement in the slave trade in 1807. It have included claims that it was no longer economically important by then and suggestions that it undermined the Royal Navy's strength during the wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France. But it is the mass movement in support of abolition and emancipation that will be the focus of this section. The abolition movement in the British Isle is worthy of study in its own rights because it was arguably the first such movement in the world, and it used methods that went well beyond the petitioning that you looked at in Unit 3 and Unit 6, such as that of the Chartists and Protestant repealers. Many of the methods introduced by the abolition movement are still a staple of public campaigns to this day. Furthermore, it was a mass movement that campaigned not for advantages for its proponents, the vote, say, or equal pay, but apparently for the benefit of others. In cultural terms, the abolition movement is a remarkable feature of the period 1789 to 1840. Its origins are usually traced to 1787 that resonated through the 19th century because latter public campaigns included those for Christian and for female suffrage. It adopted some of the methods introduced by the abolitionists. Thinking of the present, jot down some bullet points in response to the following question. Why do people trying to achieve political or social change attempt to gain publicity for their cause? To inform the public about an issue, to explain why a cause is important, to persuade people to give support to a cause, to raise funds for a campaign, to encourage those with authority and influence to act, to encourage the public to put pressure on those in authority. It could be suggested that in a mass democracy, the first 4 points are all designed to achieve the last two. Public support is needed because If the authorities do not perceive the existence of such support, they might have no motive to take action themselves. Public pressure can lead to negative headlines in the media, which could reverberate until the next election. In the period 1789 to 1840, however, there was not a mass electorate, and nor was there what we would now consider to be a mass media. Though the various reform movements of the 19th century could draw on the emergence of many newspapers, it is therefore notable that a campaign that began in 1787 and which employed a tactic such as the sugar boycott from 1791 made use of the peaceful public pressure in such a way. Slavery had been a feature of European colonies in the Americas almost since European colonisation began, but as noted earlier, slavery existed throughout the known world and had done so since antiquity. North American corsairs, pirates, were known to enslave Europeans, and in fact, attacks on Devon and Cornwall by pirates from the Barbary coast continued in the late 17th century. As late as 1816, a combined Anglo-Dutch fleet attacked Algiers in an attempt to force the Barbary states to end piracy and stop enslaving Europeans. Slavery was thus very familiar to Britons, even though it was not often a feature of their daily lives. In this exercise 7.5, we're going to take a look at an extract. It is taken from Seymour Drescher's book of Abolition 2009 and then answer the question as follows. From the outset, organised religious dissenters also rallied the movement. Unitarians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Methodists, and Evangelical Anglicans added their support to the Quaker cadres on the grounds of morality, justice, and religion. For the first wave, however, Manchester's adhesion was practically valuable to London Committee. It undercut the traditional morality policy of dualism in British political culture that had discouraged or undermined early appeals against the Anglo-Atlantic slave system. Manchester was the epitome of a booming hard-nosed manufacturing town. Although not dominated by the Afro-Caribbean slave trades, some of its inhabitants had a tangible stake in them, larger perhaps than that of any other inland city in Britain. Although some of Manchester's leading cotton manufacturers, like the Pills, would be able to muster small-scale petitions against the abolitionists, they were never to come close to the matching 10,600 signatures supporting Manchester's abolition petition, much less the larger ones that followed. What does Drescher suggest here about the nature of the mass campaign against the slave trade? Drescher first notes the broad support the abolitionist movement garnered across religious denominations, but then focuses on Manchester. He notes how compelling abolitionist support was, coming for such a hard-nosed manufacturing town. It was clear from the size of the petition mentioned that Manchester's inhabitants were persuaded by a moral case for the abolition of slavery. Even this might conflict with the business interests of the city. C.L. Brown, 2006, suggests that anti-slavery sentiments existed and were relatively widespread in Britain from the early 19th century, but that no abolition movement emerged at that time because it did not seem possible to do away with slavery. Explanations of abolition that focus on Enlightenment thinking or evangelical region and might seem to assume that abolition came about because people change their thinking and realise that slavery is wrong. On the other hand, as Brown, it is one thing to notice an injustice and something else to act. Abolition required more than just changing public sentiment. It needed an organised and determined abolitionist campaign. Abolition movement. The traditional narrative of British abolition focused on the role played by William Wilberforce, whom you briefly encountered in Units 1 and 4, often described as a man who led the campaign and ended the slave trade. In traditional Whig histories of Britain's progress, He was placed alongside other apparently far-sighted 19th century campaigners such as Florence Nightingale (1820 to 1910), who reformed nursing, and the prison reformer Elizabeth Fry (1780 to 1845). Some historians, however, have called into question Wilberforce's motives and action. It has been wrongly suggested that he wanted to abolish only the slave trade rather than slave trade itself. Brown 2006. It has also been suggested that Wilberforce was an inconsistent humanitarian because he seemed to show no concern for the conditions of the working class in the British Isles in the period. The criticism was put forward by anti-abolitionists at the time too. The religious the religiousity of many of the abolition activists has perhaps encouraged a search for their real motives of the real reasons for abolition. Brown 2006, page 335. It points out that the evangelicals in Britain abolition movement not only had religious motives, they also had religious objectives. And for many of them, the abolition of slavery was just one part of a wider mission. As historians, we do not need to consider that the efforts of well-intentioned individuals may not be sufficient explanation of abolition. It is not necessary to knock Wilberforce off his pedestal, but it is worth lowering it a little. Wilberforce was not really the leader of the abolition movement, but its parliamentary spokesman. The reason he introduced the bill after failed bill in the House of Commons is not that he was more indefatigable than the other members of the movement, but because he was an MP. The first chairman of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, usually known as the Anti-Slave Society, was Granville Sharp, 1735 to 1813, a man with a very interesting record in private campaigning, but one who was not much of a team player. His position as chairman was as much recognition of the previous efforts as anything else. The driving force behind the new society was Thomas Clarkson, whom you may recall from the exercise 7.3, who quite literally went on to the ends of the Atlantic, if not of the earth. In pursuit, of course, that become his entry focus. He not only travelled the length of the breadth of Britain to drum up support, but visited Africa to gather evidence about the slave trade there. Two-thirds of the committee at the Society's founding were Quakers, and they provided much of the organisational network, much of the original finance for the Society. Brown 2006. If we turn to reading 7.3, Anthony Benezet, The Case of the Oppressed Africans, 1783, located at the end of the unit. This is the opening section of the pamphlet published by the Quakers in London. The front cover is shown in figure 7.4. As you read, think about the type of argument the Quakers are trying to make, then write a short answer to the following question. Does the extract present a logical, economic argument, or does it make it point by appeal to other factors? Unlike the logical, economic argument you encountered in reading 7.2, that presented here by the Quakers is a motive, religious and moral. They refer to their duty and to the slave trade's inhumanity and injustice. They also try to exert moral pressure on the government with regard to whether it is fulfilling the responsibility that comes with power and authority. They suggest that due to the slave trade, Britain cannot be considered a civilized country. In this discussion, Quakers' argument must have been difficult for anyone at a time of refute. What they didn't manage, however, was to argue anything that was difficult to ignore, nor does the pamphlet address the reason for there being no appetite in Parliament to abolish slavery at that time. Throughout the unit, you have learned evangelical religion come across the Clapham section. This group of evangelicals, now are very much associated with Wilberforce and the campaigns against slavery, met at Battersea Rise House on the west side of Clapham Common in London. Many notable figures of the abolition movement were connected to the Clapham section, but it should be noted that when the Society for Effecting Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed in 1787, the house in Clapham had not yet been purchased, and more importantly, not all the figures who would later become renowned for their part in abolition were involved, or indeed even in the country. The campaigners against the slave trade and against slavery resulted in those parliamentary debates over legislation, but it was not in Parliament that most abolition activity occurred. The campaigners were conducted in print and in public meetings, but also through targeted activities such as the sugar boycott. Activity 7.7, now go to the module website 7.3 boycott. This should take around about an hour. More capital. With regard to reasons for the emergence of the organised mass campaign for abolition, Brown 2006, it places great emphasis on the effects of the American Revolution and the confirmation of US independence, as do other historians, include Linda Colley 2005, whose work you encountered in Unit 6. Throughout his book, Moral Capital, Brown argues that, although many people in the British Isles disliked and disapproved of slavery, abolition appeared politically and economically impossible, at least if the colonies were to be retained. US independence reduced the influence of the planter lobby, significant by removing the southern states of the USA from the British Empire. Caribbean slave owners might object to abolition and might employ lobbyists at Westminster, but ultimately their political power was limited, and they were unlikely to attempt secession, formal withdrawal from the empire, though some argued they would join the new USA, with whom they had interest in common. During the political and military conflict between Britain and its 13 rebellious American colonies, slavery became a propaganda weapon, noted example by the question posed by the author and lexicographer Samuel Johnson, 1789 to 1784. Why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Partington, page 370. Supporters of the American colonists countered this by pointing to the fact that all their slaves arrived in British ships, and indeed the British government had prevented some of the northern colonies from restricting the importation of slaves. Brown 2006, page 134. During the American War of the Independence itself, the British authorities used the promise of liberation as a weapon against the American settlers, hoping to stir up slave rising in areas controlled by their opponents. Although adopted as a limited expedient, they did not free the slaves of those who supported them. At the end of the war, Guy Carleton, 1724-1808, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America, honoured the pledges and refused George Washington's demand that all former slaves under British control be returned to the rightful owners. The British government supported Carleton's stand in Brown 2006. The government support of Carleton's decision perhaps relates to Brown's wider argument that anti-slavery come to be seen as bestowing moral capital on those who supported the cause. With this, defined foreign political scientist John Kane a moral prestige. In Useful Service, Brown 2006, page 457, having lost the military and political campaigns, the government could at least extract some moral compensation from the debacle. This further suggests that for many who took up the cause of abolition, anti-slave was not their only objective. This does not mean that they were insincere in their adherence of slavery, but it does suggest that their support for the cause was related to their other interests. The Clapham section saw that anti-slavery would bring prestige to its attempts to fight corruption and to reform the religious and moral values of the nation. Those for working class rights could further their cause by promoting liberty and principles and equality more in general. Brown suggests that persecution in the 17th and early 18th centuries had led the British Quaker to adopt the quietist approach, reluctant to raise their heads above a parapet on such issues. The first tentative involvement in anti-slavery brought widespread approval for parliamentarians, which allayed their fears and encouraged them to see abolitionism as a cause that would bring them public approval around 2006. We could, of course, be wary of such sweeping arguments, and there may be individuals and some groups for whom the suggestion does not apply. I would also urge you to be suspicious of tidy arguments. History is seldom so neatly explained. Brown's argument does offer a potential explanation of why the organised campaign emerged in Britain in the 1780s and why some key players decided to take up the cause. The involvement of the Quakers collectively was as important as that of Clarkson or Wilberforce. Though we would not underestimate the importance of self-confident public figures such as Clarkson for public campaigns, Brown's focus, however, is on why the movement emerged when it did, and he does not address the question of why the campaigns took the form it did in terms of campaign tactics. One of Brown's arguments, however, can offer an explanation of a question that puzzles many students of the topic. Why was there 26 gap between the acts abolishing of the slave trade in 1807 and emancipation abolition of slavery in 1883? Brown's argument that anti-slavery sentiment can translate into slavery action in abolition of slavery appeared possible might be key to answering the question. There were at the same doubts as to whether British government had the rights to abolish slavery. The rights of Westminster Parliament and the limits of its jurisdiction in the colonies had been a key component of the confliction that led to the American War of Independence. And on that issue, on an abolitionist, Granville Sharp sided with the colonists. He was not the only one. The notion of the people being property seems apparent, and it is hard to deny. That was the legal status of slaves, and if they were property, the rights of Parliament were limited, and, as the War of the American Settlers had shown, the rights of Westminster Parliament over its colonial assemblies was also open to question. What was not in doubt, however, was the right of the British Parliament to regulate trade throughout the empire, so a campaign to abolish the slave trade would not be vulnerable to accusation of the Parliament's right to legislate lacking competence, and the trade had been abolished. More efforts were put into amelioration to improve the living and working conditions of slaves until the early 1820s. When abolition of slavery again came into focus, though doubts remained as to Parliament's right to legislate on such a matter, the debates and campaigns about full abolition will be addressed in the final section of the unit. Page 328, Unit 7, still. The price of emancipation. The abolition of Slavery Act revealed Royal Assent in August 1833. The Act, which came into effect on the 1st of August 1834, abolished slavery throughout the British Empire, though until 1843 the terrorists of East India Company were exempt. So far as most abolitionists were concerned, the Act, though were very welcome, contained two stings in the tail. In the shape of a requirement that former slaves serve an apprenticeship of up to 6 years, working for their former owners, and a provision that all former owners should be entitled to compensation, a share of a total compensation package of 20 million. That compensation, a product of the British involvement in the Atlantic world, will be the focus of this section, as 20 million was a huge figure by the standards of the period. Its payment had social, political, and economic implications for the UK itself. The assumption of the public campaign. After the British slave trade was ended, there was a lull in abolition campaigning, in part because many abolitionists believed that slavery would wither and decline once the prohibition on buying replacement for slave owners to take better care of slaves. There would be a little or no advantage in having slaves rather than wage labourers, it was believed. So voluntary emancipation could be expected to become the norm. This turned out not to be the case. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the British government pursued measures to promote and to some extent to enforce amelioration, collecting information on the treatment of slaves, and requiring all slaves to be registered. Registration was partially an attempt to track the movement of slaves and enable illegal slave trading to be detected. But the triennial register of slaves, published by the slave registry offices in London, was also in, enabled abolitionists to gain access to information on mortality rates. If the treatment of slaves improved following abolition of the trade, then the number of slaves on each estate should remain constant or improve slightly through reproduction. Where members decline, therefore, this could be evidence of gross maltreatment that led to the premature deaths of slaves, and in the 1820s and early 1830s, abolitionists were willing to name it and shame. Some slave owners whose estates showed such a decline, Nick Draper, 2010, page 30, argues that the slave owners who publicly spoke out against abolition were those who were targeted in mortality rates seemed higher than their estates. The resumption of the abolition movement in 1825 is usually attributed to Elizabeth Hayrick, 1769 to 1831, and her 1824 pamphlet that called for the immediate rather than gradual abolition of slavery. The British abolition movement had supported gradual emancipation for some sort of practical reason, that it led in 1787 to focus on abolishing slave trade rather than ending slavery altogether. Hayrick's intervention may well have helped provoke the resumption of the public campaign, but the anti-slavery society did not adopt mediatism until 1830. If we turn to reading 7.4, Elizabeth Hayrick, immediate, not gradual, abolition, 1824, located at the end of the unit. This contains an opening message of Hayrick's pamphlet. As you read, make a note what you think are the most significant arguments she makes imposing the immediate abolition of slavery. This should take around 25 minutes. Significance is a matter of personal judgment, so you may well have different points from mine. I would include the following: the accusation of hypocrisy against the government for abolishing slave trade while doing nothing to prevent enslavement, the suggestion that the government's position is irrational, the self-accusation of hypocrisy if concerned members of the public do nothing, the argument that all Britain is guilty of slavery, not just the planters, the argument that by buying sugar slavery is perpetrated, which signposts that call for a renowned boycott of sugar. The suggestion is that this is a question of which neutrality is not possible. One is either a supporter of slavery or an opponent.